have to fear is
in war, there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
A safe depository for our freedoms and the powers of our government. It's right in our hands, folks. It's for we the people, and that's why Foundations of Freedom Thursday right here on WallBuilders Live is all about diving into those powers, diving into the Constitution and our freedoms, and making sure we do our part. Thanks for joining us here at the intersection of faith and politics. I'm Rick Green here with David Barton, and it is Thursday, so we've got a great Foundations of Freedom Thursday for you today. And our entire program today is going to be driven by your questions. And by the way, if you've got some questions about the Constitution or the Declaration or our founding principles or what's happening out there in our world today, send them to radio@wallbuilders.com, radio@wallbuilders.com, and you can also find out more about the program there at wallbuilders.com and wallbuilderslive.com. So, David, our Foundations of Freedom program today, we got several questions we're going to try to get to today. Our first one from Larry Robinson, he asked, how could some law from the UN actually trump the American Constitution? And he talks about the climate change treaty. We also have the small arms treaty. There's several other treaties, that, obviously the parental rights issue. A lot of these treaties that we often talk about here on the program. And the reason for us paying attention to this would be why. If it's the UN, what do we have to worry about? We've got our Constitution.
Well, and the treaties you mentioned, we have the Kyoto Treaty they tried to bring it forward through President Clinton. And now the Copenhagen Treaty, that's the other treaty. That's the climate change through Obama. Neither one to ratify, but that was pushed. Back under Clinton, you had the Heritage Rivers and Heritage Places Act that would allow UN authority over certain parts of American soil that we conceded to be
of course, David, I can't help but remind us now that Copenhagen Treaty, we both got such a kick out of that they had the global warming summit, and it was freezing.
That's right.
There when they had
it was too cold for them to hold a global warming summit.
Anyway, I just remember that. I remember us interviewing Dr. Cal Beisner, and he was there and told us how cold it was. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
So you have treaties like that, the River Treaty and the World Sites, World Heritage Sites, that when we designate, for example, Philadelphia as a World Heritage Site because it's Independence Hall and it's shaped the world, then you ceded a certain amount of your authority under those treaties to the UN to control those sites, etc. So there was that. There was a Small Arms Treaty. There's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's all these treaties that come through, and they're a real concern. And the reason they're a concern is because Article 6 of the Constitution says this. It says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties," there it is, treaties like UN treaties, "and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the constitutional laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." So when you have a treaty, it becomes the supreme law of the land along with the Constitution at the same level as the Constitution, and the courts are bound by that treaty. And that was the difficulty, is if you take the UN Convention on Small Arms, then suddenly the UN position on gun control becomes the American position, and that is the same level as the Constitution. Judges have to uphold that. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which gave it killed parental rights and gave kids rights above their parents to sue your parents and divorce your parents, whatever. Those are the type of things that would then become the supreme law of the land. So there is this real push, let's be like the world. And so that's the basis of this. That's the reason for the concern. Now, there's a couple of things that go with this, and this is where original intent is really, really, really important. Do we think when we read that clause that the Founding Fathers had this kind of stuff in mind, UN treaties, etc., that would be higher than or equivalent of the Constitution? And probably the easiest answer is absolutely no. Just make it easier than absolutely. Let's just make it no. And one of the easiest ways to prove that is in George Washington's farewell address. In his farewell address, he gets into a lengthy section on how America should conduct itself with other nations. Let me just read part of what he says here. He says, the great rule of conduct for us, that is America, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. As far as we've already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. If we've already told a foreign nation we'll do something, that's fine, but let's not go any further than that. He said, Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or ordinary combination and collisions of her friendships or enmities. And he goes in a long section and say, man, we want to stay out of being engaged with foreign nations as much as... Now, this is your ultimate isolationism. And he didn't mind having relations with them because we had commercial relations with them. He talked about that. But as far as making obligations with them, absolutely not. And so do we think that with that viewpoint, that mentality, that Article 6 actually means that if you make a treaty with a foreign nation, that has the equivalent of the Constitution of the United States? No way, shape, fashion, or form. So what's happened is because we don't read old documents like the Farewell Address, we don't read things like the Federalist Papers, we just assume that whatever the language is the way we interpret it today, and that's simply not the case. One of the best explanations I ever heard came from Congressman Ernie Istook, a congressman from Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, there are a number of Native American tribes. And as he pointed out, the aspect of treaties was particularly, and notice that in the Constitution, when you read Article 6 again, actually the language of the Constitution makes it pretty clear. This is what it says. The Constitution and laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States. Now, you can argue that a small arms treaty from the UN is not made under the authority of the United States. You can argue that the Kyoto Treaty is not made under the authority of the United States. So it says under the authority. Well, what treaties were made under the authority of the United States? Treaties with Native American tribes. And see, this is the problem we had back in the early days, is we would make a treaty, as John Quincy Adams did with the Cherokee, and Georgia ignored the treaty. They didn't like it. They didn't want it. It involved Georgia lands. They didn't want to follow through with the treaty made by the United States. And so they simply tried to set it aside. Now, that's the supremacy clause. When the federal government makes a treaty with Native Americans, it supersedes all state laws and all state treaties on that issue. Now, that's the kind of treaties they're talking about. And by the way, because Georgia ignored those acts and ignored that, eventually led to the Trail of Tears. That's where Andrew Jackson did what he did, and forcibly moving the Cherokees and Native Americans out of Georgia and Florida and elsewhere. But this was designed to prevent that type of thing, where that a state could say, I don't care what the United States says, here's what we're doing.
Right, which is why, of course, it specifically says that those judges in that state shall be bound thereby.
That's right.
Anything in that state constitution or state law cannot trump that. That it, contrary notwithstanding, it's still going to be the supreme law of the land.
But our problem is the supremacy clause, because any court today that got a hold of that would look at a UN treaty and say, oh my gosh, we're bound by that treaty, because that is a treaty, and that is the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so that's why you just don't want to mess with treaties. You don't even want to get into there, because the modern interpretation is that a treaty that's passed or ratified by the Senate through the UN is just as binding as the U.S. Constitution is.
Well, and these guys must have been very concerned about that, because they put a great safeguard in there by requiring two-thirds over in Article 2, Section 2. That helps. I mean, that's part of why these treaties, because, Obama and Kerry and the Democrats would love to have that small arms treaty become the law of the land here, but fortunately we've been able to block that because they needed two-thirds.
Well, they would also love to have the climate change treaties become part of the
parental rights.
And the world sides.
I'm sorry, not parental rights. The UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child, which parental rights
That's
get
right.
thrown out the window under that.
I mean, all of those things that are detrimental to original intent, they would love to have.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. But you're right, two-thirds. See, two-thirds was good for the Founding Fathers because that meant you couldn't just have the agricultural states, or you couldn't just have the urban states. You couldn't just have the North or the Middle or the Southern colonies. You had to have a whole bunch of folks. And so that requires really that the nation itself, not just partisan or influences of the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, you got to have the nation itself really want to do that before you can have a treaty ratified. And so that's why the two-thirds level is there.
Yeah, good safeguard there, good separation of powers. Got to take a quick break, folks. Stay with us. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday right here on WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution, but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty and Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our Founding Fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Foundations of Freedom Thursday today, and we're getting to some of your questions that you've sent in about these foundations. We got one from David Mullen. He wanted to know why the removal of the Ten Commandments is not treason. Of course, David, this has been happening across the country. Federal courts taking Ten Commandments out of various places. We had the big fight in Alabama a few years ago, but there's several cases on this. So what about his question? Is it treason to get rid of the Ten Commandments or forcibly remove the Ten Commandments?
We're talking about original intent, so let's go back to original intent. The word treason does appear in the Constitution, and it is defined by Founding Fathers, folks like Noah Webster, who was such an influence in helping get the Constitution ratified. He was the second man in the United States to call for a constitutional convention. Palatine Webster was first. Noah Webster was second. They're not related, at least not that we know of. And so Noah Webster did that in a piece called Sketches of American Policy, said we need a federal constitution. He was a Federalist. And so he's really active in helping get the Constitution ratified. He's responsible for Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And thus, when he does his dictionary and comes out and defines words in the dictionary, you're talking about a guy who was part of that whole scene back there, understands the tone, understands the debates, understands what's going on. Here is the original definition that he gave of treason in his original dictionary. He said, treason is the highest crime of a civil nature of which a man can be guilty. In general, it's the offense of attempting to overthrow the government of the state to which the offender owes allegiance, or of betraying the state into the hands of a foreign power. In the United States, treason is confined to the actual levying of war against the United States, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Now, when you take that definition, as much as we may know that the removal of Ten Commandments undermines the moral foundations, and as much as we know that George Washington in his farewell address said that of everything that makes our politics prosper, of the indispensable things of political prosperity, religion and morality were the two you couldn't separate. He even said you can't be a patriot if you try to remove religion and morality. That still does not constitute treason. It's a very unwise thing. It is certainly attacking the foundations, but it is not betraying the state into the hands of a foreign power, and it's not confined to the actual levying of war against the United States aren't adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And we're not going to define levying war as a philosophical war. We're not going to say giving aid and comfort to secularists, because that's not what they were intending. So under original intent, this is not an act of treason. It's a pretty dumb act because religion and morality is necessary for the governance of the nation, but it's not a treasonous act by definition of the Constitution.
A very, very bad policy, but doesn't rise to the level of treason. Quick break. We'll be back with your questions when we return right here on WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Our founding fathers, despite their common love for America, did not always agree with each other in politics. Such was the case between John and Samuel Adams. John was the leader of the Federalist Party, and Samuel was a leader of the Anti-Federalist Party. Consequently, political disagreements were not unusual between these two. On October the 4th, 1790, Sam wrote John and told him, "Let ministers and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite their endeavors to renovate the age by educating their little boys and girls and leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system." 2 weeks later, John wrote back and told Samuel that on this issue they both agreed. While these two prominent founding fathers disagreed on much, they both agreed on the importance of educating the next generation in the principles of Christianity.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday, and we're getting to your questions. This one's from Joe Shoemaker. He said, "I just finished listening to your podcast, and I was wondering if they've had any progress on how Mikey Weinstein has so much power. Also wondering if the results of the last election will make a difference." David, this follows up. You were just saying in the last segment about religion and morality and how the founders said how important that was in our culture. But there's some out there that are doing everything they can to remove that from our culture and certainly from our public square. In this case with Weinstein, those guys are trying to get it out of our military where we really need it. What has been happening with that? Has it gotten any better with him? You remember the show we talked about how, he files a complaint and the military says, how high do we jump?
Yeah, and it's been one of those things that I think even he's posted about how that it took under an hour for the military to respond, et cetera. He's talked about the time frame, and I think he's also talked about the access he has into the Pentagon and the folks that are there. And so how do you limit power like that? Well, it's real simple. On the other side, there's folks on that side that talk about how that I have too much access to senators and reps and governors and presidents, et cetera, and that I've got too much influence on them. And I don't believe that Mikey Weinstein has influence on them any more than I have on the others. What you're talking about is people that are fellow travelers. And when you get fellow travelers, people together that have the same philosophy, then showing up with them appears that you have influenced them. And there's no way I can, if I'm such an influential guy, how come I can't get President Obama to do what I want? Well, it's because we don't have the same worldview. We're not fellow travelers. And how come Mikey Weinstein hasn't had all that much success in previous administrations, for example, under Bush? How come he gets all the success now under the Obama administration? Well, it's not that he has more influence. It's that he's got people there that have the same philosophy, same worldview, want to have the same objectives. So this goes back to something that founding father John Francis Mercer told us. And John Francis Mercer is one of the 55 guys who framed the Constitution. And I think he made a revolutionary statement there at the convention because he's talking to the guys. Here they are framing the Constitution. And he kind of does this, oh, by the way, guys, you do realize the Constitution will be fairly useless. And this is what he said. He said, it's a great mistake to suppose that the paper we're to propose will govern the United States. It's like, time out, guys. You guys really don't think the Constitution is going to govern America, do you? He says, it is not the Constitution. He said, it is the men whom it will bring into the government and the interest they have in maintaining it that will govern them. The paper will only mark out the mode and the form. Men are the substance, men must do the business. There's all sorts of great constitutional clauses that are ignored regularly by folks who don't believe in that philosophy. So he says it's really a lot more important to have people the right philosophy in than it is to say, well, I've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. Well, the president took that oath, and of course, from an original intent standpoint, we would say he's not followed it hardly at all. But that's a worldview and a philosophical approach. So Mikey Weinstein, he's not necessarily lost power. He's lost some in that there has been such a public backlash and there's been such a public exposure of the things that have been happening and really the persecution of religious folks in the military.
And congressional pushback. There's been hearings that have exposed it and basically sent the signal over to the military to say, hey, you guys better stop this.
See, it finally got to the level that Congress was hearing about it from constituents. And, you know, I know several of the members in Congress who were calling the 3 stars and the 4 stars and saying, what in the heck is going on with this? And senior members don't like getting calls from you know, their civilian bosses. And the Constitution made sure that the civilian is supreme over the military. And so, I mean, it's the noise that's been made that's had an effect on that. But one of the reasons he's been so effective at what he's done, and he has been effective, is because he's had people around that had the same worldview and they had the same general objective. So it's really not a question of limiting his power. It's a question of getting different people in leadership, and that'll limit the power all by itself, just as it did when different people came in. Then suddenly I didn't have access to the people I had access to before. And that's a worldview philosophy.
That's the way the system works. Going to take another break. We'll be back in a moment with your questions here on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Hey, this is Tim Barton with WallBuilders. And as you've had the opportunity to listen to WallBuilders Live, you've probably heard the wealth of information about our nation, about our spiritual heritage, about the religious liberties, about all the things that makes America exceptional. And you might be thinking, as incredible as this information is, I wish there was a way that I could get one of the WallBuilders guys to come to my area and share with my group, whether it be a church, whether it be a Christian school or public school or some political event or activity. If you're interested in having a WallBuilder speaker come to your area, you can get on our website at www.wallbuilders.com, and there's a tab for scheduling. And if you'll click on that tab, you'll notice there's a list of information from speakers' bios to events that are already going on, and there's a section where you can request an event to bring this information about who we are, where we came from, our religious liberties and freedoms. Go to the WallBuilders website and bring a speaker to your area.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Samuel Adams said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks."
Well, welcome back to WallBuilders Live. Thanks for staying with us here on Foundations of Freedom Thursday. Our next question comes from Becky in Indiana. She said, thanks for your article about the letters that pastors receive from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And listeners, this is the one that they send out to pastors across the country, intimidating them from speaking on issues in the culture. She goes on to say, my husband and I are pastors of a small church in Indiana, and we received this letter. We felt it was just an attempt to silence us from encouraging our congregation to stand up and be counted. We weren't sure why we were targeted, but know that God is moving in our people to see our nation turn back to Him. So it only showed us the strategy of the enemy, and we were excited to encourage our people to vote for those who stand for biblical values. We never endorse or campaign from the pulpit, but we preach the Word of God. Once again, thank you for all that you do. David, huge issue here. Every election, pastors get these threatening letters, basically telling them no free speech for you, no freedom of religion for you. They don't say it in those words, but that's the outcome.
Well, that's the threat. And the threat is, hey, you're coming up in elections, keep your stinking mouth shut. Don't talk about elections. Don't talk about putting out voters' guides. People who put out voter guides have been sued. And, of course, they've failed to mention that we're the ones who sue them and that they've lost every suit they brought against voters' guides. But that's irrelevant. I mean, you could be sued because you got blue eyes and brown hair and wear cowboy boots. So what? So it's a very intimidating letter. For people who don't work in that field, they see that and they have a tendency to back off. But fortunately they didn't. And that's some of the articles that were put out before the elections. You don't have to worry about this letter. You don't have to back off. There's a whole bunch of legal groups that win these cases regularly at the U.S. Supreme Court, and they will defend you for free. But this is the thing about worldview again. I'll just about guarantee you that this letter, and it comes from Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Barry Lynn, same denomination President Obama belonged to, the United Church of Christ, sends out this letter, and I'll just about guarantee that nobody in the United Church of Christ got that letter because it's a way too liberal denomination. And I would just about guarantee that nobody PC USA, Presbyterian Church USA, got it, or ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. I'd just about bet that the American church pastors didn't get it. You take the United Methodists, they probably didn't get the letter. It's going to be more the Bible-believing and the conservative, the evangelical type of churches, the conservative Catholics, etc. They're going to be the ones that are concerned of these guys, and they're the ones that they really want to shut down and keep from speaking. So again, this goes back to the worldview kind of stuff, and it's really conservative, Bible-believing pastors don't have to worry about this and don't back down. And fortunately, Becky and her husband didn't, and stood up and did exactly what the Constitution allows them to do. And that's why we've got a Constitution to protect your right of free speech, your freedom, expression of religion, your right of association to choose whoever you want to be part with. You can do all that. Don't be scared of what groups like this say.
Great stuff. That is the foundation of freedom, and we got to keep speaking that truth. Thank you for listening today. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
President Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
We stand undivided.